Been reading those too, and this is a great opportunity to talk about that for a couple of minutes. I was in the business of building nuclear fuel racks. And if you think of nuclear fuel as spaghetti, well, then the rack is the box that the spaghetti's in. And if the spaghetti is straight and the box is straight, you can turn it upside down and the spaghetti falls out easily. But if the box is dented or bent, or if the spaghetti isn't straight, you're not going to get the spaghetti out of the box. Well, the same thing holds for nuclear fuel. It's essentially spaghetti-like. It's 12 feet long, and each piece is about as big as a finger in diameter. And I think it's pretty clear that the fuel racks at Daiichi have been damaged. You know, we had an earthquake on the opposite side of Japan in 2007 at the Kashiwazaki Kariwa plant, and they damaged their fuel racks. That was a bad earthquake, but it didn't have a tsunami with it, and it made it impossible to pull some of the fuel out of the rack at Kashiwazaki Kariwa. I was at Niigata, which is on the coast right near Kashiwazaki Kariwa, and a scientist said to me, you know, that was our last warning. That 2007 earthquake, we got through it. Everybody breathed a sigh of relief, but that was our last warning. And he was right. I mean, of course, it happened again 4 years later at Daiichi. So I think we can see that the fuel racks are going to be damaged. And what that means is the box of spaghetti is going to be dented. So when they go in to try to pull the fuel out, they're not going to be able to. Some of that fuel is going to be stuck, like spaghetti stuck in the box. And an earthquake like this most recent one likely caused more damage, or it caused more crap to fall into the pool. And as particles fall into the pool, again, it's going to change the friction that's required to pull out the spaghetti in the box, to pull out the nuclear fuel. I think what they're going to see is they go down with this long handle and try to grab the fuel on the top. And if the fuel is undamaged and the rack is undamaged, it slides out pretty easily. If the fuel is bent or if the rack is bent, it doesn't. So that what they can do is they can crank up the power and pull a little harder. The problem is that this is spent fuel, so it's brittle. And if they pull too hard, they're likely to snap the fuel. And what that can mean is a gaseous release of radiation. So that was a long prelude to answer your question. Why are they building these roofs over the fuel pool? Is that they're afraid that when they come to pull the nuclear fuel, they're going to snap some of the bundles and they're going to release radioactive gases. When they build that building over it, they then run that gases through a filter and then up the stack so that less radiation is released than would be to the public. So it's a vehicle to capture whatever radiation comes off the spent fuel as they're trying to pull it out.
So this cover is put there to protect the public from radiation that may come off of the fuel pool when they're removing it. What dangers do the workers face?
You know, there's been cases in the U.S. where a fuel pool area has had to be evacuated because a bundle broke. What happens is you get a burst of gases that come up into the air right directly above it, and the people working on the fuel pool have to evacuate the building until the ventilation system sucks it out.
Arnie, over a year ago we were talking about the potential of Unit 3 being, the explosion at Unit 3 being a prompt criticality, and of course that would possibly have been caused by the distortion of the fuel rods, maybe one being slammed into the other or positioning or whatnot. Is it possible when they're removing this fuel they may inadvertently create some kind of criticality?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Back last year, the water was pure water in the pool. And the only way they were absorbing neutrons was by panels in the nuclear fuel pool. It's essentially the sides of the spaghetti box were made of boron, and they were designed to absorb neutrons. And, you know, I ran a business that built fuel racks, and the dimensional tolerances are really critical. If you squeeze them too close together, you'll get a criticality that you don't want, called a prompt moderated criticality. That's in pure water. Now, what Tokyo Electric has done since then is they poured boron into that fuel pool. And the fuel is only 5% enriched, so it's unlikely that they could cause another criticality, not because the racks are any better, in fact they're worse, but because in addition to whatever boron is left in the sides of the fuel pool canisters, in the sides of the spaghetti box, if you will, in addition to that boron, that pool is so full of boron now that there's essentially probably double the amount. You know, we know, though, that the fuel is damaged. And the reason we know that is that the radioactivity in the fuel pool water is extraordinarily high. And it hasn't really come down over the last 18 months. Originally, people thought, well, maybe it was deposition from the explosions and it settled on the water. But they've been running these fuel pool cooling systems now for months and months and months, and we still see high levels of radiation in the spent fuel pools. So that tells me that the fuel bundles themselves have been damaged, either by the earthquake or the explosion or by a prompt moderated criticality or by the aftershocks.
So there's exposed fuel in the pool right now.
You know, if you think of this thing as these long tubes of spaghetti, the tubes are zircaloy, the tubes are cracked. Now, whether they're the fuel rods, the individual fuel rods are cracked.
Right.
From either the seismic motion or the explosion or the rattling of the building from the explosion. They may be completely severed, but they're certainly cracked. We call that a weeper. And, you know, depending on the length of the crack, the bigger the weep. I'm sure that you're going to find when they start pulling that spent fuel that they'll have a lot of weepers. They'll have a lot of damaged fuel. You know, and it's compounded because it's not clean water. It's salt water. This stuff was never designed to be in salt water. So you have hot, warm zircaloy in with boron and salt water, and there's all sorts of chemical reactions going. The thickness of this wall is only 4/100ths of an inch to begin with.
Arnie, what wall are you talking about?
I'm talking about the tube wall, the zircaloy tube that surrounds the uranium. That tube is only 4/100ths of an inch thick. Now, we did a video way back in August of 2011 where we lit one of those on fire. It looks rigid because it's only about 4 inches, but in fact, when it's 12 feet long, it's quite flexible because it's extraordinarily thin. And each tube weighs hundreds of pounds, so you've got a lot of weight in a very long, skinny tube, and when it starts to rattle, or when it's exposed to salt water, or when it's exposed to an explosion, the net effect is you're going to damage some of that fuel. You know, somebody said, why don't they just take this fuel and lift it out and put it right in dry casks and forget about it? That was an email just about a week or two ago. And the answer to it is the fuel is not in good condition. They're going to have to take this fuel and move it to another location that's more stable, and then analyze it rod by rod to see which can be stored and which has to be disassembled. And there's got to be a plan B here.
So when you talk about one of those tubes weighing hundreds of pounds, you're talking not about the bundle. You're talking about one individual tube filled with uranium, zircaloy lined, weighs hundreds of pounds?
The whole bundle weighs about 1,000 pounds, so that would be 8 by 8. So that would mean each tube weighs tens of pounds. So
sure.
That together the bundle comes in at 1,000 pounds. And on the top is a handle. So they come down, they grab that handle, and they pull. And, you know, it's sort of like, you know, pulling up your zipper if your pants are too tight. You pull, and all at once it'll come. Well, that's likely to be what's happening when they pull on this thing. If they pull all at once, it will slide, and of course, in the process, it's likely to cause damage. And that gets back to your original question. It started this whole riff here, is that the reason they're covering those fuel pools is because as they're moving fuel, they're pretty surely going to be releasing additional gases. And if they put a cover over the building, they can then treat those gases before releasing them up their stack.
Incredible job for the Japanese to accomplish, or an incredibly difficult job for the Japanese to accomplish. What lessons would you say this should be teaching us?
Well, I think the lesson is that the downside for this technology is extraordinarily costly. You know, we really haven't evaluated in the United States the true cost of a really severe accident. The assumptions people use on these things are designed to minimize the cost, so that policymakers in the nuclear industry can show that nuclear is the right way to go. But there, of course, is that magic word, assumption. And depending on what assumption you use, you can push this answer to be very, very, very much in favor of building more nuclear power plants. I think that's what's happening in Japan.
My last question. The word assumption, this is something we've used over and over again. This is a word that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission uses when they're calculating anything from how far an evacuation zone should be to what? What does that mean when they talk about assumptions?
Yeah, I think the NRC would couch their words and not call it assumption. They might call it the initial conditions or the starting conditions. They basically assume that nuclear fuel leaks at a certain rate. And they assume that once the fuel starts to leak, only a certain amount of radiation from the fuel gets in the water. And then they assume that when that radiation in the water, only a small fraction of that gets released into the air. And then they assume that the building doesn't leak.
So the problem, if I'm understanding, with all of these assumptions is they're calculating all of their final calculations based on assumptions which may or may not be true to begin with.
Yeah, you're right. They're looking at a series of assumptions. The net effect of all of them is that it minimizes the consequences and it minimizes the probability of a nuclear accident. So if your calculations, they call it a PRA, a probabilistic risk assessment, if it shows that the chance of an accident is very small, and even if it happens, the consequences are very low, then from a policy position, it's worth building more nukes. The problem is when you look at those assumptions, each one of them is not in the middle of the road, but is favorable to the people that want to build nuclear power plants. The key assumption is that I was at an advisory committee on reactor safeguards meeting, and the NRC staff said we were talking about a really geeky topic called net positive suction head. But the NRC staff came out and they said, we assume the containments do not leak. Now, Daiichi showed clearly that that was not the case. But in fact, Dave Lockbaum, a union concerned scientist, me, the state engineer for Vermont, we were all lobbying for years to get that assumption thrown out. Since 2005, we were lobbying the NRC that was a poor assumption. And when you figure there's hundreds of these in a calculation, just that one example, containments don't leak, of course that's going to push the policy decision that the technology is safe.
So by making that one assumption, it changes the entire calculation. It changes the entire outcome.
That's right. There's one other example of an assumption that we all make. Our listeners and watchers of the Fairewinds site assume we're going to be there. We'd like to keep it up next year and years into the future. It's not a given. We need donations. It's the end of the year and tax time, and this is a good time to minimize your tax and help a good cause at the same time. So we'd really appreciate viewer contributions, listener contributions, so that we can all make the assumption that Fairewinds will be there in 2013.
Arnie Gundersen, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for having me.